Hello students, welcome to the course named as Visual Semantics for Visual Communication. This course is aimed at making you understand how visual communication works in our daily lives and how that is being designed by many people and engineered accordingly for producing various resources, which again is utilized by human society for various needs. We will discuss more about that as we progress in the course of time. Today we will talk about the particular lecture or the module which talks about human communication. Before we talk about visual semantics or visual communication as such, we need to understand that this domain deals with the communicational aspects of human beings, and hence first we need to understand how human beings communicate and what are the different aspects associated with that communication. So let's move on with the communicational aspects of visual semantics. So if you look at the slide, we'll look at the communication with the two I's being capitalized. They represent you as yourself or the individuals. So when the communication happens, there is communication between the individuals, and this communication can happen at different levels. There could be talks, there could be other modes of communication. We will learn about that as we progress. So sometimes there is a direct communication between two individuals, and sometimes the communication happens for some other reason where you are talking about something else. This diagram represents that here there is a different concept. The blue box represents something else, and one particular individual is actually referring about that and hence communicating it to the other individual. So that means communication happens at two levels: one with the individuals directly regarding their individual needs, or at many times the communication can happen because of some other entity and hence reference to that entity to another individual. So this is the premise of human communication, where two individuals or two groups or an individual to a group communicate with each other for a particular purpose. Now if we look at communication as such, communication always deals with some amount of information associated with it. Whenever in the previous diagram you have seen there are two individuals or two entities trying to interact with each other and also trying to interact with each other on a particular common ground, which has been represented by this square. So in that case, the arrow were representing some kind of information communication which is happening within them. So communication and information are to some extent synonymous. They occur together and they are conveyed together. So if we look at the two very important aspects of information, one is the production of the information and the other is the reception of the information. So if we go back to the diagram beforehand, there was a production of that information which was then communicated to the other individual, and the other individual was receiving that. In other ways, if we have an entity E, or if we have a communicator, he is the producer of certain information, and then he transfers this information to a particular receiver. And this is happening through a process which we are calling as a communication. In our case, we are dealing with the human communication in particular. So this is the premise of the entire communication which is happening in a human domain for a particular reason, and this transformation of information is happening because of certain particular needs or requirements. So there is a particular need or requirement. For that purpose, there is a information flow from the producer of that information to the receiver of the information. The whole premise of human communication relies on that, and we will slowly discuss about that in details further. Now, another aspect of this is that information is also communicated through different channels, which information is percolated by spoken means, by written means, by a signed means. So there are different signs being used for the communication of that information. So many a times we use various signs or various techniques, various symbols for communication of that, and many a times gestured as well, or a combination of all of these things together. So if we look at again to this diagram, if we look at this particular diagram, the needs or requirements, based on that the mode is chosen. So based on this, there is a different mode of communication which comes into picture. So either it could be a verbal mode, or it could be written, or there could be symbols that being used. We will come to this later, that written entities and symbols are to some extent similar, and then there are gestures. So all of these modes are many a times either used in singularity or in combination for a particular communication to happen. So now moving on with the communicational aspects, we move on to the next aspect of communication. Human beings communicate through language. All of us use language for communication to a great extent, and that is the most prevalent form of communication for human civilization. And this is very interesting facet of human beings and development of human civilization as such, where we have come up with abstract symbolization in terms of languages. There are so many different variants of language, and within a language we have so many different dialects which work. So there is an enormous amount of language that is being used by human beings for different communication. Now any language for that matter involves using certain amount of symbols, which I have been mentioning. So language is closely related with symbology or usage of signs to a great extent. And if we now look at the two different aspects we have talked about, the reception part and the production part. So the reception part is related to auditory reception, tactile reception, proprietary receptive, which is related to your position and movement to some extent, and then the visual systems, which is very, very important in our case, because we are talking about visual communication and visual semantics in this particular course. So any reception revolves around these modalities, whereas the production relies on the voice or speech for language, the different ways of writing, the manual signs, and the gestures. So by usage of various aspects together, the production is happening. For instance, right now I am delivering a lecture to you. So I am producing certain amount of information, and how I am producing that information is through my voice and speech, through different writing that I am doing, through different gestures and different signs that I am using. So it could be a body language, it could be different symbols that I am drawing, it is the language that I am writing, it is the speech that I am talking about, which is again relying on some kind of convention which is framed as a language in terms of English language for this particular case. Whereas when it comes to receiving at your end, you are relying on your auditory senses, your visual senses, your tactile senses to some extent, depending on where you are sitting. So these kind of aspects are prevalent when it comes to the reception and production of information and its communication. So when we talk about information and communication as a whole for human beings, we need to consider these aspects as well, where the production and the reception of the information in form of various communication happen in a particular domain, and these domains have been shown in this particular fashion, and seldom it happens in other aspects which are vestibular, olfactory or gustatory senses, which are very nominal to in our case, but the communication is possible in these senses as well. So now moving on with human communication, if you recall this particular diagram again, so human communication is a subject which has been named as anthroposemiotics. So if we look at anthroposemiotics, so we have anthropo and then you have semiotics. The study of human communication relates to anthropo part, which relates to human beings. So this relates to the human being, and semiotics is basically the subject which deals with signs and symbols. So a subject that deals with signs and symbols. So we are in particular talking about human communication through various signs and symbols. This is the premise of human communication, and human communication is always happening through this domain. And the semiotics is vast. In week 2 we will discuss in detail about semiotics, and it has various aspects where we talk about the signs and symbols and various levels and various factors which drive them. So basically human communication is reliant on various signs and symbols, and it is reliant on the communication aspects. So we will now deal with this entire domains one by one. Again, relating back to the communication aspect, where we are precisely talking about the communication between the two individuals, or the anthroposemiotics. And also note that there is a reciprocation, which means that the signs and symbols has to be understood and as well as reciprocated, otherwise the communication fails to some extent. Now, study of human communication deals with two distinct channels. One is the rhetorical and the other one is the relational channels. So rhetorical channel is dealing with more of argumentation or argumentative approach, where you are arguing with different entities for establishing your point of view. Philosophically, this has been derived from Aristotle's time, or rather this is the classical form where we have tried to classify human communication as such, or anthroposemiotics, where we are trying to find out the meanings or reasoning or the logic of human communication, and the aspect which was coming up there was that of a rhetorics, or in other terms where you are arguing or trying to put forward or establish a point of view which is again countered or accepted, and based on that a communication was happening. So this is precisely trying to cast an influence. So whatever point of view you have or whatever information you have got, you are trying to cast an influence on that. So one aspect is it is influential to some extent, and in other aspect it is persuasive to some extent. So what I am trying to say is what I am trying to pursue, or I am trying to put forward a point of view, and that could be an argumentation, and that argumentation has to be accepted or rejected, and there could be counter communication happening with that. So that is one form of human communication where we are talking about rhetorics, and the other form of human communication is rather more human, and where the argumentative aspect is subdued, and this form of communication is translational, or mode of relational. So, as the name suggests, you are trying to build up a relation, you are trying to share certain things, you are trying to communicate certain things for building up the relation, for establishing not an argument, but in establishing certain kind of benevolent agreement based on which human civilization dwells on or drives. So, if we look at this diagram, it shows the two aspects very clearly. So, the rhetorical aspect is one which influences, which deals with persuasion, and it is argument centric, whereas the relational anthroposemiotics is more relational or translational. It talks about coexistence and cooperation. So, there are mutual cooperation, co-sharing, co-learning or coexistence. For that, whatever communication is required is being emphasized over here, and contrary to what has been there in rhetorics, here there is a sense of agreement. To give you an example, say for example, in a organization, both rhetorical and relational communication works hand in hand for the betterment of the society and for the functions it does. For example, there are arguments on a project or a particular assignment or a particular work. Colleagues or team members or different entities, different groups or members of the organization would actually get into a rhetorical mode of communication, where they will argue and try to establish their own points and hence come up with a communicative mode. Whereas, at the same time, in the same organization, you would find that there are cooperative communication or co-learning, coexistence, co-sharing kind of environment or communication is happening for the betterment of employee culture or for a day-to-day functioning in a smooth manner. So, in our day-to-day lives, we deal with these both kind of communication modes, and both are equally relevant in our lives. Moving on to the next level, what are the different types of human communication? Now, there are several types of human communication possible. There is, the first one is intrapersonal and interpersonal. So, intrapersonal and interpersonal communication. So, these are the first types which we encounter in our day-to-day lives. Intrapersonal communication happens when the communication is happening within self. So, for an entity, there is always a communication which is happening within your brain. So, that is the intrapersonal communication which happens with all of us all the time. So, we are living in an environment, we are receiving various stimuli from the environment, and based on that there is a self communication which happens with us. So, this is an intrapersonal communication which happens, whereas as it is understood from the interpersonal communication. So, there could be one entity and there could be another entity, and within them there is a communication, and that communication again refers to an environment around them. They are receiving various stimuli and they are communicating. If you relate back to the first slide which I have shown, they may actually refer to another entity somewhere else, and hence the communication might be happening. So, this is how two different types of communication happens in a very first place, where you as an individual is involved at a intrapersonal level and at an interpersonal level, and there could be various varieties of interpersonal communication again. For example, the interpersonal communication that you have with your friends is different from that you have with your teachers, is different from that you have with your family members, or is different from that you have with your neighbors, and this list can go on. So, interpersonal communication varies, or the degree of communication, the level of information being communicated varies for different entities from time to time. Now, if we look at the next two types of communication, there is another type of communication which is intra-group communication and intergroup communication. So, human beings are social animals for that matter. Human beings always tend to live in a group, and there are different communities, groups being formed based on different kind of entities that they have been assigned to, and based on that these groups also communicate in a particular fashion. So, in other words, we talked about intrapersonal and interpersonal, where the entity of an individual is restored and there is communication happening at an individualistic level, whereas set of individuals from a particular group, and these groups have different modes of communication within the group and within two groups. Say for example, when you are playing a football match, you as an entity is communicating with yourself, you as an entity is communicating with another person who is next to you, whereas you as an entity is part of a group as well. You are part of a team, and the team has a particular way of communicating within themselves, and the team is again communicating with the other team in a particular fashion, or maybe with the referee, or maybe with the audience. So, this is just an example, but to make you understand that groups are formed with individual entities. So, there are various entities that have been formed, and this particular group behave in a particular manner, or they communicate in a particular manner. So, they tend to communicate in a particular manner. So, this is very key to human communication, because we are segmentalized in some group or the other, say in terms of country, in terms of your occupation, in terms of your hobbies, various other ways we are compartmentalized into some kind of group, and this creates the premise for cultural communication. The culture has been developed based on this group entity again, and these groups communicate in a particular manner within the group, and at the same time this group communicate in a different manner or in a particular manner to other groups. So, this is a very clear example of intra-group communication and intergroup communication, and it is very apparent that this communication would vary based on what kind of group that you are in and what kind of activity that you are dealing with. Say for example, again let us take the example of the football match, where when two entities are on a sports ground and they are fighting for victory, the intergroup communication would be more of rivalry or fight, or there could be a sense of competition, and the communication will also happen accordingly. There would be a sense of communication by terms of verbal means, by terms of gestural means, body language, facial expression, signs and symbols, all of it will deal with a competitive approach, whereas in the intra group of both the groups who are participating in that particular match or sport, we will have a very different cooperative communication amongst them, where they are trying to help the entire team as a group for winning the competition. So, this is the premise where the communication is vastly different when it comes in terms of groups. Now, we move on to the other two aspects, where we are talking about the organizational communication or the cross-cultural communication. So, there could be communication which is happening within an organization, and there could be communication which is happening cross-culture. So, there are organizations being formed. So, these organizations are mostly based on profession or institution or activity. So, human civilization has created organizations based on various facets like this, and based on that they have different communication which happens within them. So, the organization has a different organizational communication for communicating with different members and employees within that organization, whereas the other aspect which comes into picture is the cross-cultural communication. Cross-cultural communication, where we have talked about the groups, various groups. So, there are innumerous culture which is present in our whole world, and there has been difference in communication based on the cultural aspects as well. This is day by day becoming very, very crucial in terms of coming to the concepts of globalization or the digital movements which have occurred. The communication, there is a disruptive communication which is happening across cultures. So, there is a sense of globalized communication where the world is falling flat, and there have been common communicational modes happening across culture, whereas there is a sense of localization, and different communities, different culture have different ways of communication with each other, and they communicate either cross culture or within their culture. So, one is at an organization level and the other is at a cross cultural level. So, for that matter, an organization may have different groups working there. We talked about different groups, and there could be different cultural entities within an organization. So, now we can understand how complex communication can become when it comes in terms of a bigger organization or an entity. There are different groups, there are different individuals, and there are different cultural entities. Hence, for all of this, the communication needs to be designed. So, many a times a communication needs to be designed, and it needs a professional approach, and that sets the need for this particular course. So, communication needs to be designed, and communication has to be designed in a professional manner. This creates the premise of this particular course, which gives us the insight of how visual communication happens and how the semantics is relevant for us to learn. And the last and not the least, if we look at the PowerPoint presentation, the last is the gestural communication. Many a times involuntarily we rely on gestures or body language or our facial expressions for various kind of communication. So, we will discuss in the next lecture about more of the other facets of communication, coming to the gestural and what are the other modes of communication which are prevalent. But in this particular lecture, we try to understand a little bit about human communication, the various aspects of human communication, the various types of human communication, and more importantly, what is the relevance of learning human communication in terms of visual communication and visual semantics for our society. Thank you very much.